Good afternoon, and welcome to the panel Building Archives for Evidence and Collective Resistance. This year's festival, as you have already heard and read, turns its attention to lived experience and the ways it is expressed, communicated, and registered through contemporary technologies. So images, texts, and affects are at the foreground for this edition, looking specifically into the role that the network infrastructures play. What happens, though, when platforms, devices, and systems promise to care for us, but also control and police and preempt behaviors and emotions, and how to deal with this excess of misinformation connected to sentimentalism, but also disaffection. The following panel addresses such questions in relation to contemporary conflicts and historical events, discussing the ways that stories are told and histories are written. And as with the rest of the program this year, attention is given mostly to tools and practices, projects and initiatives that embrace open and living forms of resistance. So this panel was curated together with Mihaela Brebenel from the Winchester School of Art, and Mihaela will be introducing and moderating the panel. Mihaela is a lecturer in digital media culture at Winchester School of Arts, University of Southampton. She's a screen and visual studies researcher and curator, interested in the politics and aesthetics of the audiovisual, in queer and feminist practices, and in critical uses of archival images in academic and artistic practice. She's part of the Archaeologists of Media and Technology research group at Winchester School of Arts, as well as of various curatorial collectives. Please welcome Mihaela and our speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the transmediale team for this long-standing educational collaboration with Winchester School of Art, which I am very glad to be joining into. In particular, thank you to my colleagues and mentors, UC Parika and Ryan Bishop, for making this conversation possible. A special thank you to Daphne Dragona for our rich and absolutely inspiring collaboration for this panel, for your endless care and generosity in sharing and listening. The man from the country has not expected such difficulties. The law should always be accessible for everyone, he thinks. But as he now looks more closely at the gatekeeper in his fur coat, at his large pointed nose and his long, thin, black Tartar beard, he decides that it would be better to wait until he gets permission to go inside. The gatekeeper gives him a stool and allows him to sit down at the side in front of the gate. There he sits for days and years. The gatekeeper often interrogates him briefly, questioning him about his homeland and many other things, but they are indifferent questions. The kind, great man put, and at the end, he always tells him once more that he cannot let him inside yet. Some of you have probably recognized this quote from Kafka's Before the Law and are familiar with the many academic readings of it. I will only briefly pick up on one note Judith Butler makes on Derrida's reading of the story. Quote, Derrida suggested that the expectation itself established the reality of the inner secret, so operated as a performative. We may think that the enigmatic essence of law produces the expectation that the law will reveal itself in time. But Derrida's argument was that it is expectation that posits the enigmatic essence, a kind of anticipatory performative, end quote. Recently, we have been reminded by mediatized trials that it is both what constitutes and counts for as evidence and can be presented before the law that matters, and also who presents it. As we feel, think, ways for intervening into structures that upkeep and prolong this anticipatory performative ad infinitum, an old question emerges: how to respond collectively and transnationally as a we in the face of some of the most pervasive and intruding forms of injustice derived from many long-standing social and political intersections of exclusion entwined with algorithmic capitalism, surveillance, and censorship. As Daphne pointed out, the impetus for this year has been to foreground artistic design and activist practice. The emphasis, as in this panel, has been on building archives for evidence and collective resistance, building living archives. Building archives implies building the tools and techniques for collecting evidence, for machine learning, or for grid making that resists projected totalities. The practices we are about to encounter have also, in different ways and measures, responded to the acts of image erasure and excision that, for example, Google deletion algorithms have been exerting on social media, or to the deletions that governmental censorship has been enacting in search engines. On the other hand, the construction of data sets and consequently the building of archives invoke the making of grids and algorithms that learn exclusion and making visible. The question then becomes how to fold into a navigational system this dynamic fluctuation between exclusion and making seen. Building an archive in the contemporary thus seems to stand in a shared temporality with navigating it, a living archive that points to its body. To quote Doreen Mende, who will be presenting on the panel, the archival body does not call for quantity, but asks about its psychoaffective consequences. In reverse, it means that only a single image could even be an archival body. This body does not only have shivers and fevers, but also a metabolism of its own. It lives. What role does, for instance, intuition play in the treatment of these archival bodies if we recall Lauren Berland's definition of intuition as the, quote, place where affect meets history in all its chaos, normative ideology, and embodies practices of discipline and invention, end quote. I began by reflecting on the necessity once more to ask what forms of subjectivity emerge when building living archives of resistance. What kind of we emerges in these lived experiences? And how is this we scaled, parsed out, and felt in the living archive? If that is our first challenge, then it can only open more questions. How can we make sure that our resistance stays rooted in care? And what are the affective circuits that we need to be aware of or set in place? With an excitement for discussing these questions starting from activist, artistic, and curatorial practices, I will now hand over to our speakers. I will introduce them all in the order in which they will deliver their interventions. Our first two presenters will speak to their respective roles in a collaboration currently developing for the Syrian Archive, a Syrian-led and initiated collective of human rights activists. Hadi al-Khatib has been working since 2011 on collecting, verifying, and investigating citizen-generated data as evidence of human rights violations committed by all sides in the Syrian conflict. As Hadi underlines, this work is intended to make sure that activists, journalists, and lawyers are able to use the verified data for their investigations and criminal case building. Hadi has previously worked with Tactical Technology Collective for the last 5 years and as open source investigator with Human Rights Watch and Bellingcat. Adam Harvey is an artist and independent researcher based in Berlin. He works on surveillance technologies and has worked on camouflage from face detection, anti-drone thermal signature reduction garments, and the Wi-Fi geolocator emulator. He collaborates with Syrian Archive, developing Vframe, a toolkit for computer vision, which he will talk further about today. Next, artist and researcher Winnie soon will walk us through a few concerns raised in her practice. Her works explore themes around computational culture, specifically internet censorship, data circulation, real-time processing, and the culture of code practice. Her current research focuses on aesthetic coding in the realm of software studies, working on 2 books, Aesthetic Programming, a Handbook of Software Studies with Geoff Cox, and Fix My Code with Cornelia Solfrank. To conclude, Doreen Mende will provide a response to these practices, drawing from her own trajectories as curator and theorist. Doreen is currently professor for curatorial politics at HED, Geneva, Switzerland, and founding member of the Harun Farocki Institute here in Berlin. At the moment, Doreen is working on decolonizing socialism, archival metabolism, and the slow research titled The Navigation Principle. Please welcome our first speaker, Hadi Khatib.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks Transmediale for the invitation. I'm going to go through the Syrian Archive project for the next 10 minutes. So the main reason why we started working on the Syrian Archive was to build a counter-narrative to the disinformation created by all sides in the Syrian conflict since 2011. And we are doing that by collecting, verifying, preserving visual documentation related to human rights violations by all sides in the conflict, in order to use it for 3 main things. One thing is to support advocacy research that is published by international human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. The second thing is to assist in criminal case building. And the third thing is to be part of a transitional justice process for the future in Syria by building a digital memorial archive for the Syrian people. Since 2014, we have been working with many different institutions, universities, organizations, in order to develop our tools, methods, as well as workflows. This includes, for example, the Commission of Inquiry to Syria that were documenting violations since 2011, as well as the OPCW, who were responsible for documenting chemical attacks in Syria, and other different organizations. And of course, we have been working a lot daily with Syrian journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders, and Syrian people who were mainly the ones that are documenting these type of violations in order to expose the human rights violations that are happening in their neighborhoods. So just quickly about the Syrian context, since 2011, it has been very hard to access crime scenes in Syria and understand what's happening. It's not easy for organizations or journalists to go there. That's why there is a lot of dependence on publicly available materials captured by the Syrian people and published on the internet. Right now we are in 2019. The Syrian regime has won the war, and it's like even so much harder to access the country. It's not even possible. So that's why it's very important that we try to use these materials as much as possible. Because it contains untold stories, a lot of human rights violations that happen, and potentially evidence of war crimes. A very important milestone happens about using this type of materials publicly available on social media, that the International Criminal Court has used it for the first time in history to publish a warrant of arrest against a perpetrator, Warfali, who made war crimes in Libya, and they depended solely on social media, publicly available Facebook posts, which is a very good milestone for us on how we can use this practically for legal purposes. And this is why this material is important for us, and this is why we try to address very specific problems that we are going through right now of the Syrian Archive. One of them, the content is being lost on a daily basis. That's because the Syrian people are operating in hostile environments. They are encountering cyber attacks to their social media accounts or websites, and also because when they publish online, the automated flagging systems have been detecting these materials automatically in order to remove them. And we have raised awareness about that during 2017, 2018, and also this year, because it seems that social media platforms such as Google are going to be using more and more machine learning in order to flag content automatically to be able to erase it. The content, as they say, that is content is extremism content, propaganda content. This is why they are doing this. Only between July and September 2018, 7 million, more than 7 million videos has been removed, which is a very huge number. As you can see here, this is from the transparency report of YouTube. We can see that more than 6 million only removed after automated flagging. So because we are also archiving these materials, we understand what's in it very well. And it was, we can say only like 2% of it really related to extremism, and most of it, like 98%, it's really related to human rights content and human rights violations that were happening, as well as daily life that people were posting about what's happening in their areas. We can see here all the materials that we have archived since 2011, 2018, and in the blue is the peak in 2018, where hundreds of thousands of those videos were removed silently without anyone knowing from Syrian civil society. So that's why it's important for us to go through archiving, and we have archived about 3.3 million digital units so far between 2011 and right now. The second problem we are going through is related to verification, because there's a lot of propaganda and a lot of disinformation published around these materials. Like this is one example related to photos from the from the Russian Ministry of Defense, where they are publishing about a video that the US is covering in ISIS combat, and they're using in that a YouTube video that are just about that, showing that type of evidence. So this is why it's really important for us to go through verification when we work on these materials. And this is why we developed tools and methods in order to do that. This is a very quick example on how we actually go through these type of incidents. First, we capture the evidence, then we identify all landmarks related in that specific incident as the photographer moves through the incidents. And then we try to go through geolocating that place exactly, just to make sure that it's actually happened in Syria and not in other countries. And once we do that, we also use satellite imagery in order to see what happened before and after the incidents. And in some cases, also, we are able to identify munitions that has been used in specific attacks, like this one, for example. And by doing online research, we are able to understand who is the producer and where it came from. This is submunition of Shoab, and this is its container. It's a cluster munition that is internationally prohibited to be used, especially against civilians, which has happened in this incident. The Russian Ministry of Defense denied that they have been using cluster munitions in Syria, even though in Russia Today video from a journalist who was capturing videos of their preparing of flights shows that submunitions were actually loaded on their aircrafts before conducting airstrikes in different areas in Syria. This is why verification is very important for us. The other problem we are facing is related to the scattered nature of these materials. Usually because it's very scattered all over the internet, it's really hard to find it. It's really hard to put it in one place. It's really hard to kind of understand the context using it. And this is why we developed a metadata schema with the help of many different groups in order to tag every piece of information with this schema. And with this, we are able to understand patterns and strategy of military and how attacks were happening against civilians using this type of schema and processing. The archives doesn't only include the materials of the Syrian people, but also includes the materials of governments that also published videos about their operations in Syria, like the US government as well as Russian government as well as others. So we also have an archive related to that. This is another example of how processing also happens through building collection to understand patterns. And this is one of the collection that we have worked on related to chemical attacks that happened in Syria. It was about 861 videos from about 193 sources, it has been done between 2012 and 2018 so far. And from it we understand a lot of the pattern and strategy of the military, why they have been using it against civilians. The other thing is related to also the ability to build the chain of command out of these materials. We are able to understand more about who is making orders, how does this execution happen through going through these materials as well. So all the tools and methods related to this is published online on our website, and it's all open source. The last problem and the biggest problem also we are facing, like any other group, civil society group working on this with limited resources, is scale. We are about 3-4 people right now, and we are dealing with 3.3 million digital units. So scale is a very big issue for us, and this is what my colleague Adam is going to present in the next 10 minutes.
I met Hadi about 2 years ago at a data investigation camp, and he mentioned he was working on this project, and he was looking for people at the camp to help him review videos. So as someone who has a background in some computer vision programming, thought about this problem and realized it's well suited for what computer vision could contribute. If you look at 9 videos, you realize that it's already becoming overwhelming. You have a chemical attack, you have an investigation, and people showing evidence of cluster munitions. How is it possible to scale to an enormous archive of 3.3 million videos, of which 5,743 are verified? When you think about the payoff, you have only 0.17% of the videos actually contain information that would be useful in the archive, such as these 2 videos showing evidence of what's called an AO 2.5, which is a submunition, as Hadi mentioned, dropped from a larger cargo munition, and another video showing evidence. Yeah, the problem is, how do you kind of amplify the capabilities of a small team? And Hadi also mentioned the problem of scale, and you have information everywhere. How do you collect that into a single channel where somebody can review it? So we started prototyping tools, and I'll review 3 of them briefly that we've been working together on to improve the manual review process of these videos. The first one is what's called scene summarization. It's a tool, instead of looking for very discrete markers where a camera switches off, you look at the actual content in the video and use a content-based approach to find when the scene changes enough, make a scene poster frame from that, and generate a contact sheet, and then only show the 12 most useful frames. So that's able to reduce, as I'll show you, the perceptual workload to review videos. The next thing is an image search system, which I imagine everyone is familiar with, but we build our own, and we do that at quite a large scale with about now 15 million images, so every video contains many keyframes. And quickly you run into problems of scale, even with hardware and server. How do you search 15 million videos? How do you hold that many image features in RAM to search them? And we've developed a system that works well for an interactive way of investigating. The third system is object detection, which is kind of the parent category of face detection, which people are probably more familiar with, would be a sub-category. Object detection can be anything. So you can train that on cluster munitions, you can train it on cargo munitions, you can train it on respirators and look for indirect signature evidence of chemical attacks in that way. So first, quickly, the way the scene summarization works is that you, as I mentioned, look at the content of the video, and then you show the most important part of it. If I'm looking at a video 2 minutes long, maybe you can scrub through it and get through it a little bit quicker. But if you look at this dense summary, that only takes 3 to 5 seconds. Our perceptual systems are very quick at scanning an image for useful information. So again, a video that's 5 minutes long, basically what happens is there's a person picking up a cluster munition and showing it to the video. You do this over time. It can also help reduce the exposure to watching traumatic content. And so it takes maybe 5 to 10 seconds to process on a GPU. And the result is, if you were to look at 3 million videos at about 3 minutes each, that's going to take roughly 171 years without a break, so a theoretical number. If you were to look only at one image, which represents the video, it goes down to 173 continuous days. So while this may not seem like the most complex or sophisticated type of computer vision technology, it's developed specifically for a use to reduce the perceptual workload of researchers looking at the videos. And you can see how much that could help. The next tool is the image search. And this one is a short demo that shows you if you would like to look for trucks. If you have one photo to start an investigation, then you can use it in an interactive way to explore the archive and find the videos and look at all the keyframes of the videos using the tool I previously mentioned to speed up, to reduce the time to investigate a particular objective, whether it's a chemical attack with helicopters or looking at ambulances that may be the result of an attack on the street. And the next thing is object detection, and this works by isolating specific objects in images and videos. Videos are just a series of images. And what you quickly run into is a major problem in data. In order to find something, you need many examples of that image to train a detector. So you run into the problem that is described here by Geoffrey Hinton, one of the founders of artificial intelligence, that the way we program computers with artificial intelligence is with data. So how do you program an object detection system if you don't yet have that data? Well, the first thing you would probably do is look for existing resources. For example, the largest, most expansive image set in terms of classes, with over, I believe, 7,000 classes, is the Open Images V4 dataset. And it does have a category for weapons, so let's look inside weapons, and we find bomb, missile, handgun, tank, shotgun, knife, dagger, cannon, and bow and arrow. Well, maybe there would be something in bomb that could help, except actually 4 images in this whole category. 2 of them are cartoons, and 1 of them is a firework. So there are 0 helpful images in the largest publicly available object detection training set. So of course we have to make our own. And the first thing to do is to understand what exactly is a cluster munition. And I think of this step as training my own neural network. I have to learn the parameters of what an AO 2.5 is before I train the system. And that means showing me a lot of images and telling me about it. and realizing that they fracture, they're covered in dirt. The lighting, the quality of the photo is going to change a lot. Sometimes it's not even the full munition. You only see evidence, shrapnel. These are the arming fins. Sometimes they appear and they look not much different than any kind of metalware, a bowl. Sometimes they're upside down, and sometimes they're hollowed out. So already you have quite a range of ways that one single object of many that we need to detect appears, and you realize this becomes quite a challenge. For example, we went through the archive and extracted, using the search system, the videos that had an AO 2.5, and then we drew the annotations on them. We ended up with about 975 annotations, which is not even yet enough to train one single object detection algorithm on that class. We have about 100 classes that we want to train on, so how do you even begin to construct the visual knowledge graph for this many items? And that is the new project that is an extension of Vframe. We realized that we can't detect objects without first having data to train on them. Training data is quite expensive, or it doesn't even exist. If you wanted to create, get 2,000 annotations for 100 classes, that's quite an expensive project to undertake. So how can we work around that and find new options? We can learn all about this object and then 3D model it. We can look at all the ways it appears and texture map it. Then we can begin to render scenes based on the way that people are photographing it, embedded into the object detection trained neural network is not only the object, but the way people are looking at it, which is with smartphones and head-mounted cameras. We can change the lighting, which is important so that we don't overfit the models. And then we can isolate each one and extract the bounding boxes and generate training data this way. We can scale this up and change the camera angle, change the way the objects are appearing in it, and generate enough training data that we hope that we can begin to scale up and reach closer to 100 classes at some point. Another part of this is that we 3D print some of the objects that we've been 3D modeling. And we do this because it's much different when you can see it in real life. The objects in the video are always at a distance. And so we've 3D printed this cluster munition that I've been mentioning, which you can come down and look at. And I think it helps put into perspective the reality that these really do exist and that they're lethal. We can use that in a workshop too to help train researchers to identify the object, because it is a one-to-one scale model that shows you all of the pieces, the payload, the arming fins, and the detonator. And then we put all these elements together and we end up with an object detection system that ideally we want to process the entire archive and turn it into a text file, a CSV, or put it into a database so that we can query if you're looking for evidence of cluster munitions or a chemical attack. All that information would be pre-populated, and Hadi and his team could query that database and right away find the most important videos. The idea is not at all to replace researchers, but to make their work a lot faster and to improve the capabilities of small teams. Just want to say in wrapping up that the project is about facilitating visual testimony from conflict zones around the world by using computer vision to navigate, as Hadi mentioned, large volumes of citizen and journalist collected data. I think it's also important to put this in context. As someone who studies a lot of surveillance issues, the most powerful computer vision tools today come from Facebook, Google, IBM, and they're primarily used for tracking consumers. In fact, a lot of Intel's new neural network computer vision models are developed for retail environments. So Vframe is about using very similar technologies, but enacting a new way of seeing. And I think instead of turning a blind eye towards these surveillance issues, the same tools can be used, taking advantage of the surplus of surveillance capitalism to enact a more just way of seeing. And thank you to everyone who's helped with this project. Josh, 3D modeling, 3D prints from Karlsruhe, and kind of research collaborations with Laki Kermode at Forensic Architecture and everyone at Syrian Archive. Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank Daffy and Mihaela for organizing this panel together. So I'm very delighted to be part of it and to think about the potential of living archives. So regarding my talk today, I will be focused on the notion of erasure as a form of artistic practice, but perhaps in a much smaller scale of living archives that are primarily related to moving image and network platforms. So erasure as a form of remembering and resistance through repetition that challenges the state, the self, and platform censorship and erasure. The question that I would like to pose here is, how could we think about erasure as rather a generative mark, an act of production that is co-executed by human and non-human agents? So to give you an idea about my general practice and research interests, so I'm an artist and researcher. My works most of the time address computational culture in a broad sense, exploring cultural, social, political implications of computational materials and digital infrastructures. Thinking about the relations with and through technology. So projects range from installation, software arts, video, and performance. So perhaps every artist may have a series or a body of work that's repeatedly dealing with similar things or issues, but not quite sure what and how to articulate. So this is a series of my work repeatedly deal with a more complex affective experience concerning the gap between Hong Kong and China. So born and raised in the city of Hong Kong, a place that was under British rule for 156 years. So we have our own language, currency, the rule of law, and more importantly, culture. So after 1997, which is more than 20 years from now, we have sort of handover back to China, running the so-called one country, two systems. So over the years, what is seen is that there's a gap in understanding on democracy or human rights between Hong Kong citizens and mainland China who operate, govern, and oversee Hong Kong. So apparently, we can see shrinking freedoms in Hong Kong as manifest in a lot of protests that were initiated by students and different political parties. But also, there are increasingly new forms of politically sensitive subjects that are hardly touched upon after the handover. And sadly speaking, we noticed that some artworks were being self-censored or violently erased in many art exhibitions by different levels of institution. So as an artist that witnessed this drastic transformation and clashes which come with complex political subjects, fear and anxiety, I'm actually not quite sure where this series of work will lead me to from a researcher perspective. But I guess as an artist, this series is sort of examining the limit of the regulated self and exploring the potential of materials, yet having a desire to understand, a desire to express, and a desire to resist with and through technologies. So for this presentation, I want to focus on two artworks that I have done earlier. And they have used similar approach with montage technique to explore the double meaning of erasure, how political subjects are being erased, and how to use erasure as a practice to reveal, obfuscate, intervene, and resist existing structure. How the artworks become object of desire. So the first work that I want to show you is a live animated GIF called How to Get Mao Experience Through Internet. So it was first made in 2014 as a static GIF. And after a year, I made a customized computer script to trick the web browser so that every fetching of the GIF image through the network is considered as a new image. Although it is made as an animated GIF with fixed frame rate, the infrastructure of the machine and the internet bandwidth here in this auditorium changed the way on how the GIF image is performed in uncertainty. Hence, the montage runs over the network remind a set of bodily and labor practices, such as selfies, different activities of workers, demonstration in solidarity, photo shooting, gun shooting, and even dying. If you have been to Beijing, you probably went to the Forbidden City or the Tiananmen Square. So every year, this place attracts millions of tourists. The images were found images from various sites like Baidu, Flickr, and Google. The whole execution transformed the image itself through a set of bodily practices and material process, such as the compression of images from one format to the 24-bit containing only 256 colors of image. So the layering and composition of this montage, placing the portrait at the center, following the practice of artist Matthew Britton, which placed it at the center of the image canvas and forcing us to keep our focus on just the Mao portrait. Such layering of composition and compression may be similar to how events and details are being forgotten and erased from histories. But at the same time, the repetition and the computational loop, the material nature of an image GIF expresses the uncertain becoming, and it creates new transformative potential on how we might register and remember events, acknowledging what had happened and how it affects the ordinary life and social experience through this small collection of archival image and run over a network. So the second work of mine I want to show you and talk about is called Unerasable Images, which was just released in last year. It is a collection of screenshots that I made over a year in 2017 to trace a particular Lego recreation of a tankman scene, sort of a very iconic image regarding the June 4th protests and massacre in 1989, which was also related to the Tiananmen place that I have explored before. I witnessed this impact of psychological and societal trauma through television's lens and different media since I was at the age of 10. The age where I started to have independent thoughts and I can remember things fairly clear. The tankman image had been repurposed many times by other artists, both from the West and the East. The interesting part of the digital ecology in China is that when it gets closer to the date of June 4th, people try to think of ways to hack the system, sustaining their mourning, the desire of mourning through finding ways to escape the censoring machines. Most of the time, this kind of visual tankman will quickly get censored, and I could imagine it might be sustained slightly longer than text. And there's only a really short golden window for visibility. So scholar Margaret Hillenbrand also addressed this time span in particular, and she said, because of their fugitive ephemeral character, perform a key role within the context of ongoing state suppression of the June 4th protests, a memory, end quote. So sometimes you do see images leak out to the Twitter platform, for example, and get viral and picked up by Western press. Indeed, censorship like the Great Firewall or even the social credit system is not a secret at all in China. But when we zoom in at the subject of the June 4th, Hillenbrand described it as public secret, especially for those people who live in China and born in before mid-70s. This historical event is generally known, but cannot be articulated anywhere within China. Perhaps images become a way of imagining new forms of memorial every year. But most of the time, the repurposing of Tang Man comes with the doubleness. Humor does not simply entertain, but can also transmit taboo information, as Hillenbrand put it. Another layer of my relation and concern as a Hong Kongese is whether we can still hold memorials publicly for the Tiananmen Square protest in the limbo yet cosmopolitan place of Hong Kong every year. Furthermore, the historical event, June 4th in particular, is basically an indicator to test how much freedom of speech is left in Hong Kong. Because reporters will ask politicians about their views on this particular incident, how they think about vindicate June 4th, for example, what kinds of slogan we can still chant publicly, but not get arrested or remembered by any human or machines, which may hinder the future and life in many different ways. As one may remember, umbrella protests and revolution in 2014, and those people who initiated Occupy Central with love and peace are still suffering from the process of legal charges after 4 years. So as such, my relations to June 4th are constantly reconfiguring, subject to the political climate, policy changes, and also my distance with the subject matter. So back to the work, Unerasable Image. This one. I'm not so much interested in repurposing the Tang Man per se, but I'm more interested in exploring the matter of image circulation through geopolitical sites across machines and algorithms. I'm specifically interested in this specific image of the Lego recreation, with the Tang Man blocking the column of advancing tanks. And this image has been successfully uploaded in 2013 on a Chinese web portal. And unsurprisingly, it was censored and erased on all online platforms subsequently in China. But this image, after 4 years, is still searchable, and it occasionally prioritized on the first few rows of Google image search. So among many different versions of the artwork from video, installation, and software, I'm going to show you a full video, which is around 3 minutes, about my whole year of tracing this image manually through the bodily practice of screenshots, which captures the search results of inputting a keyword with simply the 2 numbers, 6 and 4, in Chinese character. So state censorship is just the departure point of the work. The erasure of images, apparent grid structure, might give us a different perspective on examining the power relation within computational censorship across sites and on different platforms. But what I have been thinking is the movement of this archive may hint at a new form of archival practice that point at technological infrastructure. How could we capture or archive such complex technological indexing, relations, prioritization, personalization, etc.? Or is it make sense or even possible to archive this? Then I leave you with my last and initial questions. How could we think about erasure as rather a generative mark and edge of production that is co-executed by human and non-human agents? And that's the end of my presentation, and thanks for listening.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed, specifically to Mihaela for composing this panel, but also for Daphne and Anna and everyone being involved here to prepare and set up this afternoon. And of course to the audience for coming here on a Saturday grey afternoon. It's quite cold outside, and but not in here. So how do I get... I just, okay, I think I've set it up. Yeah, thank you very much. So my role is a bit double. I'm supposed to give a response, but also introduce kind of narrations and ideas that I have been developing over the last 10 years that's been kind of concluding at this very moment, not finished yet, as an idea of an archival metabolism. And Mihaela has mentioned that before, that how can we understand the image beyond its representational frame? And I think this is something very specific that we have encountered in its problematics by Adam's presentation, but also by Hadi's presentation regarding our contemporary condition to understand the image in its kind of ununderstandable excess of the scene. This is pretty much how Opera Envisor understood the archive regarding like the image component as an excess of the scene and of that what we have seen, of what has been kind of exposed in front of us. And I would like really to propose to understand the image much more in a complex way, as an image complex, as an image infrastructure. And I think this is also something that all the presentations have been proposing to us here this afternoon in order. And I would like to introduce also a question to how to imagine an archive that is somehow immediate, a present, that consists of its own memories and its own reproduction. And I would like to propose in this kind of discussion here something very important that I think might get more and more important from my perspective in order to avoid a certain kind of traps and pitfalls of the 20th century understanding of the archive that, as we all know, Michel Foucault has famously defined. The archive is first of what can be said, of what can be put into language, of what can be kind of reproduced or inscribed, that also, of course, is leaving a trace, but also is kind of bound to a jurisdiction of the question who has access to this law, who is outlawed by the law, in order to avoid that we kind of, again, fall into this kind of trap of finding and defining kind of instances of truth or instances of kind of well, I mean, like to understand that what we see is a kind of an instance of an argument for truth, to remind ourselves the differentiation between a testimony and an evidence. And I think this is something quite important if we think about the archive, because, and I will go to a few examples of projects that I have been engaged with in the last couple of years in order to elaborate that, because that's what I have seen, what I have heard, what I have been spoken into kind of a recording instrument, we could understand as a testimony, very important as a kind of a witness. We can also consider this as what Susan Schubley would consider this in its politics of materiality, as a material witness, to be able to encounter that what is being kind of has happened, as an archival trace, as an archival impulse, let's say. In difference to that what we can understand as an evidence. And an evidence, I think, is much more promising in this regard, even though not outlawing the testimony at all, but the evidence is a process of absolute heterogeneity. And I would like to indicate this on a project I have been involved in a collective called Double-Bound Economies, Doppelte Ökonomien, that engaged into an image archive from the GDR, German Democratic Republic. It started like 10 years ago already. It's an ongoing project, and it deals with an archival kind of substance, archival body that consists of about 20,000 images. Each single image is a testimony of a very specific historical event. That's what Mihaela also was referring to in the beginning. Like each single image has been taken by one photographer, but the archive itself departs from a kind of a political reality that does not exist anymore. And I think this is something really specific for many kind of elaborations and conceptualizations of an archive theory of the 21st century. That's something but the Syrian Archive, we share with the Syrian Archive, with the Palestinian Archive, very specific archives. I cannot go into all these details. That this kind of archive theory of the 21st century is very much informed by non-institutional kind of conditions and forms of knowledges that are under permanent threat and permanent danger to be erased, to be disqualified. So Double-Bound Economies deals with this kind of excess of the scene of a kind of very specific economic reality of the International Trade Fair in Leipzig. I cannot go into this detail, it's also just accessible. And just to indicate here, we also have here this technology or material existence of the image in very kind of analog photography, but we transformed this and reproduced this into digital images, digitized, together with Armin Linke, Estelle Blaschke, and a large group of, researchers and artists and designers and, people and friends. And I'm showing this to you in order to indicate here this kind of heterogeneity and the need to understand this kind of archival, the image complex regarding when we speak about the archive in its various kind of manifestations and various forms of layers. Double-bound economies here, we developed a software and infrastructure in order to be able to trace, to record not only this kind of the moment of what I have seen, the testimony, but also to create an infrastructure and a kind of a tool, an instrument, in order to understand the multiplicity and the conflicting voices, the conflicting narratives regarding this very specific historical event that here brings together a complex of economics, Cold War, design, factory workers, and photography. So this is kind of a proposal to think the image beyond its representational horizon. How could we kind of articulate or process, metabolize an archival substance in order to mobilize a set of testimonies, a set of perspectives, a set of voices, a set of inscriptions into something that is able to operate in a different way and in a kind of a way that is able to make a kind of an argument or create an evidence for, a moment of historical erasure when it comes to certain infrastructures and political realities. So I think what you see here is kind of an index of working the archive through this kind of idea of an archival metabolism by inscribing into this kind of infrastructure all the voices, all the usages, all the activations, and the calling up of these images from this very specific archive that we have been elaborating in Double-Bound Economies project. And maybe just, I go further, Another very short project, because this also has been mentioned earlier, the Traveling Communique project that has been dealing with also another image archive around the non-aligned movement that had its first summit in 1961 in Belgrade in Yugoslavia as formative kind of partner together with Jawaharlal and Sukarno in Indonesia to form the non-aligned movement as a political revolutionary sequence in the condition of the Cold War, to propose a third perspective, a third horizon, to be not aligned with superpowers. I just would like to show this here to you because this kind of image complex also what I would like to invite us to think through and take on board to understand an archive theory of the 21st century is it's kind of the reproducibility of image kind of material and archival substances towards the possibility to exceed it and to mobilize it in kind of social environments where we are not bound to the power and the violence of the architecture of the archive in terms of its kind of juridical and institutional formations when we are discussing accessibility and also kind of the question of the law, who is able to have access to this. So this is a situation when we are discussing this very specific archive of the non-aligned movement in Addis Ababa in March, April 2014, with artists and architects, poets from the artist Netza Art Village in Addis Ababa. The non-aligned movement was very important also for the formation of a political and revolutionary moment in Ethiopia. Haile Selassie was very much involved in also the conversations around the non-aligned movement. And I just would like to kind of end this kind of very short intervention to return to this question also, to this image that is somehow immediate and a present, that consists of its own memories and its own reproduction. How can we understand this kind of archival substance, archival processing, to make a differentiation between also quantity and quality into a very contemporary and present moment? This is an installation shot here from the work that was of Traveling Communique being part of an exhibition at the House of the World Culture a couple of years ago in the framing of After Year Zero. And I think this is kind of the immediacy and the urgency to rethink the archival impulse in the present, to understand kind of an image as an image complex, to engage into these kind of layers composing this image complex. It allows us to repoliticize, but also to include the conditions of engaging with archival traces in a very moment of contemporaneity. And I think this kind of these questions are resonating with quite a few, with all the presentations in terms of also the question of how, for example, in the Vframe project by Adam Harvey, this question of metadata is informing a different way of seeing that I would like to understand also quite, I would like to understand a bit better and would be lovely to discuss this in terms of articulating and claiming and also like shaping a condition of contemporaneity to engage into this new way of seeing from a position of a politics of the present. So I hope this is kind of helpful and activating to open up a few avenues to enter the conversation that we are going to have now all together here on stage. Thank you very much.
Doreen, for leaving this on this very conversational. Okay, so Again, thank you everybody for your presentations, and thank you, Doreen, for leaving us on this conversational note, which we can maybe pick up straight away. And I am aware also of time, and after we have a few questions in between the speakers, I will open up straight for the audience to ask questions. So think through as they will be discussing and prepare your questions. So I guess maybe I'm wondering if Adam or Hadi have any replies to this last note that Doreen left on, or any other questions. We can start from there.
Doreen, you mentioned enacting ways of seeing with metadata. So if we think about computer vision as the type of algorithm, the type of model that you train enacts a certain way of seeing. If you think about, you build a face detector, and then you look at faces. If you build a gender recognition system, and you implement a binary way of seeing gender. So depending on how you train it, the data, the labeling, you create and enforce a way of looking at the world through that. So with this project, it's trying to enact that in a different way, to look critically at videos coming from conflict zones and to see them as evidentiary media.
Is this a question? Okay. Thank you. No, I think perhaps, I mean, I really enjoyed Winnie's presentation a lot, to kind of this double bind of erasure. On one side as a kind of a political form, I mean, as a structural kind of condition also of structural violence, but also how could that be turned into a kind of a possible methodology to open up a more complex understanding of a kind of a very rehearsed and stereotypical, perhaps, kind of image of a certain political reality in China and how one positions oneself to it in the form of a selfie. I just was wondering about these kind of new ways of seeing, because I think this is extremely important, extremely interesting in the framework of a more complex understanding of the image, when we also take into consideration metadata as one layer, the modes of distribution, the modes of circulation, the modes of kind of archiving this kind of information, while we are still kind of stuck or still engaged into quite a representational surface, let's say, of the image. When we are trying to create categories, we did try this with double-bound economies to create categories, like a female worker working on the production of bulbs, for example. We had all these different categories, and we realized it would not work for activating this kind of archival framework into a contemporary urgency in terms also of its sociability and transgenerational kind of conversation. And perhaps this is just something, because I think there is a kind of the neuralgic point, which I find quite fascinating. On one side, to have this kind of attachment to the image in this modernistic principle of representation. We compare and collect these categories of, we have a kind of a bluish object detection being able to be detected. So how do you not fall into the trap of this is in danger to repeat certain kind of representational kind of categorization that we don't want necessarily to activate fully. Do you understand? I mean, I would like to understand the more these kind of new ways of seeing in terms of what you've presented. I think this was my burning question sitting through the whole presentation. Thank you.
I guess that's for me. So we do consider these tools to be powerful. For example, I mentioned Intel has become a big player in retail recognition. If you want to download their software toolkit, you have to agree to not export it to North Korea, Sudan, or Syria. These are designed for retail recognition, so they're for understanding pedestrians from multiple camera angles, for understanding emotion, for understanding counting faces. They are, I didn't realize until I read that, considered to possibly fall under ITAR, International Treaty on Arms Regulation. We do have discussions about specifically where we want to go, and we try to limit potential, dangerous ways of thinking about tools. If they're open source, we'll be open to anyone. And we focus very specifically on, for example, the cluster munition as a case study, or the cargo munition container that is delivered from. There are many other categories that are considered, and we may not have time to do all of them, from looking at drones, Reaper drones, or you also have a very wide variety of kind of homemade drones becoming more popular. And respirators. So these are, if there exists a danger, I want to know about it, but I've considered the potential for them, and I haven't run into an issue yet for what we've been looking at. But of course, the material is powerful, and the way of looking at it can be powerful and of course misused. But I think the tools already are misused, so I'm trying to reappropriate them.
Just want to respond to the thinking about what you mentioned about the image representation, and also I think in my work I'm more interested in the temporality, or in relation to the image and the wider geopolitical sites, I would put it this way. So that's also the reason probably the image is shown in a way that is you can't really able to see each single frame in really detailed manner, but you sort of able to guess the temporality of the movement, as well as to also think about what this kind of grid structure, this or hidden layer of like thumbnail, what does it mean by a thumbnail that's reduced the size of the image, and how it relates to the ecology of the platforms as well. So I think I'm slightly actually moving away from the thinking about the representation of the image itself, and also think about this kind of relations and temporality is quite important in the culture as well, and how might we capture this as maybe new form of archives. Maybe. Yeah.
Something that struck me as interesting during your presentation is how we talk about images as if they're standalone items, but they're always existing within so many other frameworks, from the proprietary codecs that are used to display them, to the systems that route the information, to the display screens. Really, in your archive, also everything exists as a video format, so it relies on many layers of infrastructure to sustain the validity of these media files over time, is to also consider the lifespan of codecs and image formats and the playback systems to analyze them. Most of them actually aren't open source that are used for, I would guess most people refer to a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF file when they talk about an image. Now, JPEG is not an open source format, so there will be new formats for images evolving over time, but there's something interesting that your presentation made me consider.
Yeah, and I was also thinking that, in a sense, in the working with this video archive presents or poses an inescapable problem towards this, the representation of violence and violent act that is there, and then that has led to this care for the perceptual workload, which people working with the images need to take in those representations of violence, and then that creates then an infrastructural problem in how much of that can one person take. So, yeah. Maybe if you do you want to comment or add something to this?
I mean, just about that, I think what we are facing is that the large scale of images and the scattered nature of them, and the thing that we are trying to go through is how we can actually create a narrative out of them and include different type of aspects. So this is how, for example, we conducted a way of doing that through investigation, so through going through different type of narratives from everyone and organizing that.
Thank you. So we will open to questions now. So if, the microphones are set in the rows, so if anybody has a question, please go to one of the mics. There's the mic right there. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for sharing your important work. So my question basically goes in line with what Doreen was arguing, and I see the necessity and importance of the work of building those archives, especially in those war zones and for a Syrian case. But I would be interested in the process and actually the problems you encounter. You were talking about metadata structures and how important those metadata schemes are, and they are so important for organizing the way we are seeing the world, and we are believing we seek some kind of reality. But we know these things are very liable to the context. And so I was wondering, what problems did you encounter in the process of finding metadata schemes and organizing your images? And you already talked about training data, how difficult it is to get enough training data, but there's also the question of bias. So training data is never neutral, and metadata is never neutral. So how do you work with these problems?
Okay, so the metadata schema, it was a long process that took quite some years. It wasn't something that has been created based on specific standard, for example. But what we have been doing is we have been actually talking to the people who are capturing the images. And we have been asking them the question of what is really the important thing that you want to make sure that you can see the image again in the future. How are you going to look for the image in the future? How are you going to search for it? And based on that, different type of meetings with the people who captured those images, we are able to create this type of metadata schema. But then also there comes the question of if you want to use it for specific purpose, let's say for legal purpose, then you need also to look for it in a specific way and add specific metadata to it to present it in a court. And there is no way out of that, and this is why we added different type of metadata into the scheme. And I think it's like a process that it's still like being improved and built on, because as we go through the images, as we find things that we think maybe someone that would be able to find it in this way or other way. It's really hard to discover the materials, and there's no such clear way of doing that. And we're really trying to add to it as we go and as we learn more about what we have, because right now we still know what we have actually.
And in terms of the risks of encoding bias, not being aware of them, there's also the importance of understanding the bias. When rendering synthetic data sets, you need to understand the bias because you do encode that into the trained neural network, and the bias includes the type of camera, phone that people are using, the weather climate, the height of the person that's documenting it. Some people will hold it up, and so you get a different perspective on it. But these are all things that I think are important to include bias, because the model has to be biased to work correctly in the environment, with understanding also the context, depending on the neural network that you're using. It's the full image sometimes that you're looking at, and you need to include things like that it may be next to a wall and the texture of that wall. So those are all kind of data points that inform the bias of the training data that's needed. It's not so much taking everything that's out there and feeding it through a network, but in curating a very specific, honing the performance of the detector to operate within the footage that exists in the archive. Another example is in aircraft, and you have to first look at all the videos and understand how people are looking at the aircraft in order to understand the footage, the documentation that they've made. We're not, generally detecting an aircraft. We're detecting an aircraft in a video that someone has made, and it's a very specific way of kind of media and process for understanding it and extracting metadata about it. So the biases can be dangerous, but they can also be important for getting the right performance out of the detection model.
If there are questions, could you please queue next to the microphone? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the panel. It made me think about something which I think in various ways are part of basically all the speakers' projects, which is sort of about the question between how do we create or keep a collective memory and history through images, and also in the situation where we both have the sort of erasure of images that also Winnie pointed to and that you pointed to in the Syrian Archive, and at the same time you also have a sort of ubiquity of images. So you also even have a sense where there's like too many images, an overflow of poor images that are perhaps overshadowing memory or memory of lived experience, for instance, of living in Syria or living in China. So yeah, so maybe you have some reflection on that.
So in terms of maybe like the scale is like really like a big issue that we are facing, as you have mentioned. But I think the way that we are trying to think about it is when we are able to start this kind of process of going through the images, archive them and organize them and catalog them, then it will be, for example, a way to kind of like a start to engage with the groups who captured these images, or to engage with anyone who would like to contribute into like going through this process. I think it's a very big scale, but I think dealing with those images is going to be like the way forward for actually dealing with what happened, and for actually thinking about like the transitional justice process, and this is how we are actually thinking about it. I think what we have is literally like one aspect of what happened, and we're trying to find ways of adding the different counter narratives to it. So like how also governments talk about specific incidents. So what about official statements, press conferences, and other type of things? So also we're trying to think a lot about like how to construct this digital memory, because it didn't happen before. I think the Syrian case with the digital content in it is like the first time of history where we see this really large scale, and the way that it needs to be presented, it's something that we are really thinking about a lot.
You were talking about the scaling issue of image productions. I think for the project that I've shown is very particular subject matter that I'm interested in collecting, and I'm not quite sure whether this is really overloading in the context of China, because it's overloading in a sense it's never able to be visible in a way. So in a way, able to see those images and appear in other cross domains and platforms is another kind of relations with this scaling issue, I would say. Not just only thinking about the quantity-wise, but also about how this image are distributed and circulated, and how it's being erased, and this golden window that it's able to sort of escape from one domain and then to other domain. But then at the same time, then you enter in other kinds of filtering and censorship. And it becomes obsolete. It becomes something that's out of the frame. And I think this kind of structuring or infrastructural aspect of how images circulate is very interesting to me.
Thank you both. We have time for a very quick question because we have to start another event soon here.
I think it's very interesting, this question of the censorship of the images. But I was also wondering, what's about the possibility of the manipulation of images? So we have seen how you train the data sets as well, and you use digital technology like 3D objects, like to train the data and make simulations. In how far these images can also be simulated and can trick your algorithms and become part of the archive. And also, like with all these info wars which are outside with different parties, especially in Syria, fighting against each other, producing content. Is this also something what you encounter as a problem in your daily work?
I mean, it's something to keep an eye on, but like synthetic, false, fake data is not to the point outside of the realm of faces, which I've seen a lot of work for deep fakes. Rendering the complete scene is something that we keep an eye on, and the workflow right now is to not use the computer vision tools to verify anything, which always goes to a team of multiple researchers to verify them, which you can say more about. So the role of the computer vision tools is really to float the highest priority media elements, the videos and images, to the top for the manual review process. And then it becomes important to understand all the capabilities. For example, you look at these deepfakes and synthetic media, and you can see telltale signs that will tell you that it has been faked. So it's important to stay on top of everything that's going on in that area, if you want to add.
Yeah, very quickly, we also encounter a lot of misinformation through videos, definitely. It's something that we see on a daily basis. And for us, really going through the research of when this happened, what happened exactly, and where, and using different type of tools to understand where and things like that. Verification is quite important in every part of the work. And this process, it's the process that it actually leads into like the training software that ASM is working on.
So here we will conclude, and I would want to thank again all of our speakers, and I will ask you to join me in thanking them.